Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to give a quick update on the recent activity at the summit of Kilauea. And this is a presentation that we gave a little while back, so I can give some updated numbers and insights. This is an airborne image of Halemaumau, and you can see in the center the small crater lake at the bottom, at the deepest part of the crater. So this is a view from the western caldera rim. This is the point that we make our most common observations. It's also a place that we have a webcam that's operating 24/7. And you can see, again, that the crater lake remains pretty small, and it's filling the lowest part of the crater. And obviously, this is Halemaumau looks a lot different than when you probably last saw it. With the activity of 2018, it's much, much deeper. The floor dropped about 550 meters, so quite a bit. And it enlarged kind of laterally quite a bit as well. And the water pond was first observed on a helicopter overflight on July 25th. It was quite small, maybe 10 yards or 30 feet across. But since that time, it has steadily risen and enlarged. And this webcam animation shows about a month of growth of the pond. So in mid-October, this is what the pond looked like. Today it looks, it's obviously a bit deeper and a bit larger. But this gives you a general sense of what it looks like. What you have is a kind of a yellowish, greenish blue color. You have steaming from the surface, and there's also circulation that you could see. So at this time, the pond was about 400 feet long, as you can see here in this dimension here. This is east-west. But today it is about 520 feet. So it's expanded quite a bit. So obviously this is larger than, much larger than a football field to give you a sense of scale. This plot goes up to late October, but obviously we've been updating it since then. The pond has been steadily rising, and it's been rising at a rate of about 5 or 6 inches per day. That rate has been very, very steady. So today it's about 60 feet deep. I can give you an idea of just these cartoons or these sketches can give you an idea of what the water table looked like below Halemaumau. So from 2008 to 2018, we had a lava lake that was active in Halemaumau, and the lava lake was fed by a conduit, and presumably that drove off any groundwater. Basically, it was too hot for groundwater to exist there. And so you had water that was driven away from the active magma conduit. In 2018, we had the large collapse of Halemaumau and the surrounding area, and the water table was still presumably very deep, but was not present in that collapse zone. In the past year and a half, we've had the groundwater table basically return and infiltrate that collapsed area. And now we have the top of the water table intersecting the very bottom of the crater. So what we see today is basically just a small expression of the larger, more expansive water table. And presumably, and what we're watching today is the growth of a crater lake. And it's rising as the water level here is basically reaching an equilibrium with the surrounding level. There is a well, a scientific well, that's about a mile south of this spot. And the water level there is about 60 yards higher than it is in the pond at the bottom of Halemaumau. So there's potential for the water level in the pond to rise potentially that much, 50 or 60 yards. If it did that, this blue dotted line would show you about how big it would be and how much of Halemaumau crater it would fill. So it would obviously expand in size quite a bit. Now, we monitor it with thermal cameras, and we know that the water pond is quite hot. It's about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and this is telling us that it's heated by the magmatic system. This is fairly hot for a crater lake. So the thing to emphasize is that the growth of this crater lake has been steady, and there are currently no signs of imminent unrest. The water pond itself is stable. We have a slow and consistent rise of water, no obvious changes or abrupt changes in the color or the surface activity. And at the summit in general, we have basically the magma is recharging the magma chamber. So in 2018, we had a very large drainage of the magma chamber, and now magma from depth is steadily recharging that magma chamber. But this recharge so far has been steady, and magma remains deep in the system. We have very low rates of sulfur dioxide emission, and however, we know that the pond, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, the pond itself is absorbing some of that sulfur dioxide. Now, we do have elevated seismicity compared to the activity before 2018, but so far it's been relatively steady and not alarming. The pond is important because there is a relationship at Kilauea and other volcanoes between water and explosive activity. In some cases, magma interacting with groundwater can trigger explosive activity. And that's the main concern when we see water on the surface at Kilauea's summit. For instance, in 1924, that was a relatively small explosion. There were blocks that were deposited on the caldera floor and small amounts of ash outside of the caldera, minor effects outside of the caldera. A larger concern is larger scale explosive activity. So in Kilauea's geologic record, there's a long history of larger scale explosions at the summit, and these explosions affected the entire summit region, including what are now populated areas like Volcano Village and park infrastructure. But these events happened, of course, hundreds of years ago, basically between 1500 and the early 1800s. Some of these explosions were thought to be triggered by rapidly rising magma interacting with surface water or groundwater. But the exact conditions that produce this explosive activity are not well understood. Most likely, any explosive activity at the summit would be preceded by detectable precursors, such as rapid inflation that was signaling magma and rising to the surface, or increased earthquakes. And that would be the most likely indicator. There's always, at volcanic lakes, there's always a small chance that small kind of gas-driven explosions can occur without much warning. But presumably these would be small and their impact would be limited to the caldera region, inside the caldera. Because of the potential hazard, we're keeping a very close eye on the summit. And we have a number of different tools. We're monitoring it 24/7 with webcams and now thermal cameras. We go out nearly daily to make measurements of the water level. Again, thermal camera measurements to track the temperature, which has been relatively steady. Basic visual observations and documenting of the lake appearance. We go on overflights to get an aerial view. And of course, Kilauea Summit has one of the most robust monitoring networks of any volcano on Earth. So we have seismic, ground deformation, and gas monitoring. This slide was made before we did water sampling, but in late October, we used a drone to sample the water chemistry. And tracking the water chemistry of a volcanic lake is very important to look for changes at other volcanic lakes. Changes in chemistry have been a precursor to eruptive activity. What we observed is that the pH of the pond was about 4.2. It's not terribly acidic, not as acidic, I think, as many people expected, and that was telling us that fresh groundwater is basically mixing in. It's telling us that there's an influx of fresh groundwater from the surrounding water table. The sulfur content in the lake was high, and that's, again, confirming what we already suspected, and that was that the lake itself is absorbing a lot of that sulfur dioxide emission. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll the presentation ends there. Thank you.
The water table you were
Mm-hmm.
mentioning, that is, there's a well that's about a mile away.
Mm-hmm.
And is that where you folks measure,
Mhm.
take your measurements?
Mhm.
Yes. So is there anything aside from what you covered that, aside from the explosion and stuff,
Mhm.
that you think is something that we should be concerned about, aside from what you're talking?
Yeah, I think the main thing to emphasize is that even though it's unprecedented in the past 200 years that there's been a large body of surface water at Kilauea's summit. But so far, and over the past year, the activity has been stable, and thus far, there's no signs of any imminent change. Of course,
Okay.
we've seen at Kilauea things can change
Right.
pretty rapidly over the course of weeks or months. So that's why we're always continue to keep a close eye on the summit.